He claimed he was one of the most dangerous serial killers in American history. Not just a murderer, but a drifter predator who said he hunted along highways, in rest areas, in cheap motels, and anonymous campgrounds across the United States. According to his own words, he killed men, women, and children, then left their bodies in fields, ditches, and remote backroads where no one would ever find them. His name was Donald Leroy Evans. To some, he was a forgotten nobody, a homeless drifter lost in the background noise of America. To others, he was a monster who confessed to a trail of bodies stretching across multiple states. But there was a problem. The more investigators checked his story, the more it started to fall apart. Some of his confessions matched real, unsolved crimes in chilling detail. Others collapsed the moment detectives checked dates, locations, or even basic facts. This film is the complete story of Donald Evans, from an ordinary childhood to a drifting, violent adulthood, to the moment he was exposed by a single brutal crime, and then tried to reinvent himself as one of the deadliest killers in American history. To understand who he really was, serial predator, compulsive liar, or both, you have to start at the beginning. Before he was a headline, before he was an inmate, before he was a serial killer in news reports, he was just a baby in a small American town. Donald Leroy Evans was born on April 5, 1957, in Watchung, New Jersey, a quiet suburban community with ordinary houses and ordinary streets. Nothing about that place suggested it would produce a future child killer. His early life did not turn him into a celebrity or a success story. He did not become a star athlete, a top student, or a respected professional. Instead, as he moved through childhood and his teenage years, his life started drifting in the opposite direction: instability, conflict, and trouble. As a young man, Evans began to come into contact with the law. He got into problems that showed a pattern: disrespect for rules, disregard for other people, and a willingness to use force or threats. He never built a real career, never rooted himself in one place, and never developed the kind of stable relationships that anchor most people. Instead of settling down, he learned to move. He moved between jobs, between states, between cheap places to sleep. Every time something went wrong, he simply left and tried again somewhere else. By the time he was an adult, Donald Evans had turned into what police would later describe him as a drifter. Evans's drifting lifestyle was not just about poverty or bad luck. It became a tool. Living on the road, in motels, campgrounds, and rest areas meant he was constantly surrounded by strangers who knew nothing about him. He spent time in states like Texas, Florida, Mississippi, and others, often near highways and truck routes. He blended into the world of transient workers, truck drivers, hitchhikers, and travelers. In that environment, faces come and go every day. People remember you for a night and forget you by the next morning. For law enforcement, people like Evans are difficult to track. They do not leave a clear, stable paper trail of jobs, addresses, and routines. If such a person decides to commit violent crimes, connecting all those events across states becomes extremely hard. Over the years, Evans accumulated more accusations and more arrests. He showed aggression, he showed a willingness to hurt others, and he showed no interest in changing his path. He was not a professional, highly organized criminal. He was chaotic, unstable, and dangerous, the kind of man who could explode without much warning. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, his drifting life and violent tendencies had merged into something truly threatening. He was a man with a criminal history, no roots, and a growing darkness inside him, moving through regions where no one really knew who he was. In 1991, Evans found himself near Biloxi, Mississippi, staying around a campground. This was the kind of place where families on vacation, workers on temporary jobs, and full-time travelers all lived side by side. They shared bathrooms, showers, and common spaces, assuming that everyone around them was basically safe. Among them was Donald Evans, just another stranger in an environment full of strangers. He did not stand out as a celebrity or a local. He was simply that guy at the edge of the crowd, someone people might notice but never truly know. On August 4th, 1991, the illusion of safety shattered. Evans entered the campground shower facility where a woman was alone and vulnerable. Armed with a knife, he attacked her, threatened her, and raped her in a place meant for privacy and safety. The assault was vicious, fast, and terrifying, leaving her traumatized and the small community around her in shock. After the attack, Evans tried to do what he had always done: disappear. He left, hoping to fade back into the flow of travelers and vanish before police could react. But this time, there were witnesses who had seen him around the campground and a victim who could describe him. Police acted quickly. They collected descriptions, canvassed the area, and soon identified Evans as the suspect. He was arrested and brought into custody. For officers handling the case, they had just taken a violent sexual predator off the street. They thought they were dealing with a simple rape case that would end in a serious prison sentence. They were wrong. Once Evans started talking in the interrogation room, the case would turn into something much bigger and much more complicated. In the interrogation room, detectives focused on the rape. They asked Evans where he had been, how he got into the shower building, why he attacked the woman, what he did afterward. He answered, but his calm, controlled manner stood out. This was not a panicked first-time offender. This was someone used to dealing with police. Then, without being forced, he shifted the conversation. Evans started talking about another crime, a far worse one. He began to describe the abduction of a child from the Gulf Coast area. He talked about seeing a young girl, taking her, and ultimately killing her. The detectives realized quickly that he was not describing a random fantasy. His story matched an unsolved case, the disappearance and murder of a 10-year-old girl that had deeply shaken the local community. He mentioned details that had never been released to the public, specific locations, sequences of events, and actions that only the killer should know. In that moment, the man they had arrested for rape became something else. He was now the prime suspect in the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a child. Within a single interview, their case had escalated from a brutal sexual assault to a potential serial predator with at least one confirmed murder on his hands. For investigators, this changed everything. If Evans was telling the truth about this child, there was a real possibility he had killed before. They had to know how far this went, and he was very ready to talk. Once he realized that detectives were listening, Evans began to expand his story. He did not stop at the one child. He started hinting, and then outright claiming, that there were many more victims. He said he had been killing for years as he drifted between states. He described picking up hitchhikers on lonely highways, targeting sex workers near truck stops, and attacking people in and around motels and rest areas. According to him, there were bodies scattered across multiple states, many of them never found, many of them never even reported as connected. The numbers he gave were staggering. He talked about dozens of murders. Sometimes he suggested 50 or more. To hear him talk, his adult life was almost a non-stop chain of killings stretching from state to state. Word spread quickly. Police departments in other states were notified that a man in Mississippi claimed to have killed in their jurisdictions. Detectives traveled to question him, hoping he might finally solve unsolved cases that had haunted them for years. Investigators began building maps on their walls. Each time Evans mentioned a city, a highway, or a rest area, they marked it. If even a fraction of what he was saying was true, they were dealing with one of the most prolific killers they had ever encountered. As Evans kept talking, the story was too big to stay inside interrogation rooms. Soon, reporters learned that a drifter in Mississippi was claiming responsibility for murders across multiple states. Articles and TV segments began to describe him as a self-proclaimed serial killer with a possible body count in the dozens. Headlines focused on the most shocking pieces. A homeless man arrested for rape at a campground, now saying he had killed again and again while moving through Texas, Florida, Louisiana, New Mexico, and beyond. They repeated the numbers he used, the language he liked, turning his words into a public image. To a general audience, he suddenly looked like a hidden super killer who had been operating in the background for years. For families of missing people, his name landed like an explosion. Some heard that he might have killed in their area and wondered if he was finally the answer to years of silence. Others felt immediate anger that a man they had never heard of was casually connecting himself to their loss. Evans, who had spent most of his life as a nobody drifting from place to place, was now getting exactly what he had never had: national attention. In prison interviews and conversations, he leaned into that role. He spoke like someone who had experience and power, describing killings as if they were part of a dark career. The more people listened, the more he fed the story. Because for men like him, every new audience is another chance to enlarge the legend. While the media repeated his claims, detectives did something simple and crucial. They checked. They compared the dates he mentioned with official records. They matched his supposed locations against where he was actually documented to be at those times. In jail, in another state, under some kind of supervision. Very quickly, the cracks began to show. In more than one case, Evans placed himself at a murder scene when records proved he was somewhere else entirely. Some of the victims he described did not match any known unsolved case in those areas. Sometimes he named towns or even states that did not line up with real missing person files. When investigators pressed him, the details shifted. A victim who supposedly died in one state suddenly moved to another when they questioned him again. Timelines blurred, ages changed, methods of killing were altered to fit whatever the interviewer seemed most interested in. The more they cross-checked his stories, the more it became clear. His confessions were not a clean list of facts. They were a mixture of truth, guesswork, and invention. Yet they could not simply walk away from him. He was definitely responsible for the murder of the 10-year-old child. There were also a few other cases where his information came uncomfortably close to reality. That meant buried somewhere inside his lies, there might be real answers, and that is what kept detectives coming back to his cell again and again. As the investigations went on, two different images of Donald Evans existed at the same time. The first image was clear and undeniable. He was a violent predator who had raped a woman in a campground and murdered a child. He had proven he was capable of cruelty and lethal violence, and he belonged behind bars for the rest of his life. The second image was the one he was trying to sell, a record-breaking serial killer with a body count that might rival the most infamous names in criminal history. In this version, he wanted to be seen as a man who had been killing for years across half the country, outsmarting police and building a secret graveyard only he knew about. It was an image designed for maximum fear, maximum attention, and maximum control. For detectives, this combination was extremely dangerous. They could not trust his numbers or his storytelling. Too many of his claims were provably false or badly distorted, but they also could not dismiss him as a harmless fantasist, because they knew he had already taken at least one young life and left a long record of violence behind him. Every time he confessed to a new murder, someone, somewhere, had to check. That meant pulling old files out of storage, re-examining crime scene photos, speaking to families who thought their case was long frozen. It meant reopening wounds for people who had spent years trying to live with unanswered questions. Evans turned his own story into a trap. Ignore him and risk missing the truth, or believe him and drown in lies. With so much chaos around his confessions, the justice system focused on what was absolutely solid. The child he had described in such specific detail was real. Her murder was real, and the evidence connecting him to that crime was strong. That case became the core of the prosecution's effort. In court, the jury heard about the kidnapping, the assault, and the killing. They heard about how his description matched the secret details in the case file, and how his movements placed him in the right area at the right time. They also knew that he had bragged about other murders, but those claims, by themselves, were mostly noise unless supported by hard proof. The courtroom was not a place for his self-created legend. It was a place for facts. In the end, those facts were enough. Evans was convicted of the child's murder and sentenced to death, a penalty that matched the brutality of what he had done. Later, his death sentence was reduced to life in prison, but that did not change the core reality. Officially, in the eyes of the law, he was a convicted child killer. The rest of his supposed victims remained stuck in a gray zone, talked about, maybe suspected, but rarely proven to the standard required in court. Prison took away his freedom, but it did not take away his desire to talk. Evans continued to speak about his alleged crimes, giving interviews, writing letters, and sharing stories with anyone who seemed willing to listen. He seemed to enjoy the power that came from being the one with answers, even when those answers were unreliable. Inside the prison system, his reputation followed him. Other inmates knew he was a child killer, a label that can make someone a target behind bars. They also knew he claimed to have killed many more people, something that could inspire fear or hatred depending on who was listening. For staff and officials, he remained a problem. He was dangerous, manipulative, and constantly trying to reassert his importance by hinting at more crimes he could discuss. He stayed on the radar not only as a violent prisoner, but also as a living puzzle piece in multiple unsolved cases across different states. Then came a moment that proved he was still a very real threat, not just a man who liked to boast about past violence, but someone who could still cause fresh danger in the present. In 1993, while being moved under guard, Evans managed to escape custody. A convicted child murderer with a history of violence and a long list of claimed killings was suddenly on the outside again. For a brief but terrifying period, he was no longer just a name in a case file. He was a fugitive in the real world. The response from law enforcement was immediate and intense. Search teams were deployed. Helicopters, dogs, and heavily armed officers were brought in to comb the area where he had vanished. Authorities warned the public that a highly dangerous prisoner had escaped and that people needed to be extremely cautious. For the communities in the region, the fear was very real. This was not an unknown stranger. This was a man whose face had already been in the news, tied to the murder of a child and claims of many more victims. The idea that he might be moving through neighborhoods, fields, or back roads again was enough to put entire towns on edge. Eventually, the manhunt succeeded. Evans was tracked down and captured, ending his brief return to freedom. But the escape left a lasting message. Whatever he had lied about, his danger was not imaginary. Even after his conviction, he still had the ability to threaten lives simply by being outside a locked cell. After his recapture, Evans returned to the prison system with no chance of release. He remained what he had always been: volatile, manipulative, and steeped in violence. He still talked about his alleged murders, still tried to hold on to the identity he had created, still played the role of the notorious killer in conversations and letters. In the world of prison, reputations have consequences. Being labeled a child killer is dangerous. Being a loud, attention-seeking inmate who brags about killing dozens of people can make you a target, a trophy, or a problem for other prisoners. On January 5, 1999, violence finally turned back on him. Evans was stabbed and killed by another inmate inside the prison. There was no dramatic final confession, no carefully staged last interview. His life ended the way many violent lives do behind bars, fast, bloody, and without ceremony. With his death, any remaining chance to fully separate his truth from his lies disappeared. Whatever real victims he had beyond the child he was convicted of murdering remained locked in the incomplete records and partial memories he left behind. Today, the name Donald Leroy Evans does not sit neatly in one category. He was absolutely a real killer, a man who kidnapped, raped, and murdered a child, and likely committed other serious crimes as well. At the same time, he was a manipulator who inflated his body count to build a twisted legacy around his own name. For investigators, his case became a warning about the dangers of offenders who mix truth and lies in their confessions. Every false claim wastes time, money, and energy that could be used to solve real crimes. Every half-true story forces detectives to reopen old wounds for families, only to sometimes discover that they have been dragged into a performance. For families of the missing and murdered, his behavior was especially cruel. Some were told that Evans might be responsible for their loved one's death, only to watch that lead fall apart under scrutiny. Others never knew whether to believe that he was involved or not, left forever in a limbo built by his words. In the end, Donald Leroy Evans is a reminder of something deeply unsettling: that evil is not always just in the crimes themselves, but also in the way a killer can exploit grief, attention, and fear to shape how the world remembers him. Somewhere between the murders he definitely committed and the murders he invented, the real man disappears, leaving behind a distorted shadow that still haunts case files and unsolved tragedies across multiple states. Was Donald Evans a true serial killer or just a dangerous liar chasing notoriety? Write what you think in the comments.